July 21, 1945. The war had been over for only 2 months, but in the small German town of Hochst, the smell of ash still clung to the air like a second skin. Streets were cluttered with broken brick and the black ribs of burnt buildings. Women carried buckets past ruins that had once been bakeries and shops, while children kicked stones barefoot, their thin arms swinging like reeds. Hunger was constant, measured not by the clock but by the hollow ache in the stomach. And so, when a different smell drifted through the rubble that summer evening, it stopped people in their tracks. It was not smoke or boiled turnip. It was richer, heavier, with a sharpness that seemed almost luxurious, the scent of sizzling meat, mingled with a faint hiss of carbonation. Few recognized it at first. For 6 years, Germany had lived on rations, on ersatz bread baked with sawdust flour, on soups of cabbage and watery potatoes. The idea of fat hitting a hot pan was a memory most had long since buried. Children sniffed the air like startled animals, then crept down the narrow lanes that led to the schoolyard now occupied by American soldiers. What they saw made them blink. Young men in olive-drab uniforms gathered around field stoves, laughing as they flipped patties of ground beef onto iron plates. Beside them stood crates, stamped with bold white letters. Coca-Cola. Bottles were lined up in the dust, caps pried off with the casual ease of boys on a summer outing, fizz foaming over the rims. It was a tableau so strange that for a moment the civilians thought it might be a trick. After all, only months earlier, these same uniforms had been feared, approaching with tanks and rifles. Propaganda had painted Americans as brute. Yet here they were, sleeves rolled up, their helmets tossed aside, handing food to one another with grins. Some leaned back against their jeeps, sipping dark soda as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The townspeople hesitated at the fence. A boy of about 10 clutched his sister's hand, his eyes fixed on the hamburger a soldier lifted to his mouth. He could see the juice running down the man's fingers, glistening in the evening light. His sister whispered, "What is that?" He shook his head. They had no word for it. Meat between bread seemed like a fairy tale. One of the soldiers noticed them and gave a half-smile. He walked toward the fence, holding a bottle of Coke by the neck. The glass was sweating from the cold, beads of condensation rolling down to his hand. He held it out. The children did not move. Their mother, standing behind them, stepped forward quickly and tugged them back. She muttered, "Neen," under her breath. Fear was still heavier than curiosity. For years, Germans had been told that Americans were merciless, that their kindness would be a trap. Hunger warred with mistrust in that moment. But the soldier did not force it. He placed the bottle on the fence post, gave a little nod, and turned back to his companions. The fizzing sound seemed louder now, as though it mocked the silence of those watching. Slowly, the boy reached out, his fingers trembling. The Coke was sweet on his tongue, a rush of sugar that almost stung. His sister's eyes widened when he passed it to her. "It tastes like fireworks," she whispered. Word spread quickly. By the next evening, more townspeople gathered, drawn by the same scent. They came with wary steps, with the tightness of those who had learned that nothing was given without cost. Yet each time, the Americans handed food across the fence. Patties tucked between slices of white bread, bottles uncapped and pressed into reluctant hands. A teenage girl bit into a hamburger and gasped. Grease dripped onto her wrist, and she licked it instinctively, ashamed of her own eagerness. Later she would tell her neighbor, "I did not know bread could taste warm." The contrast was unbearable and intoxicating. Only weeks earlier, official ration cards had listed 1,000 calories per day for adults. Barely enough to survive. In some cities, it was worse. Children had bellies swollen from malnutrition, mothers fainted at work details. Now, a food born of plenty arrived in their midst. It was not just meat and soda. It was a revelation of a world where scarcity did not rule. For the Americans, these gestures seemed almost trivial. They had been raised in a country where Coca-Cola was sold on every corner, where hamburgers were as ordinary as rain. To them, it was camaraderie, a way of softening the hard edge of occupation. A GI from Ohio scribbled in a letter home, "We gave the kids some Cokes tonight. You'd think we'd handed them gold." Another wrote, "It's strange. These folks look at us like we're magicians, just for opening a can of Spam or flipping a burger." Yet for the Germans, it was disorienting. How could enemies who had reduced their towns to rubble also feed their children with laughter? How could those who had bombed their homes offer sweetness in a bottle? A woman whispered to her sister, "If this is democracy, it tastes better than we were told." That night, the children slept with sticky fingers and the memory of bubbles on their tongues. For the first time in years, their dreams smelled not of smoke but of food. Still, unease lingered. Was this kindness real, or only a prelude to demands? Would the same hand that offered bread tomorrow close into a fist? As the sun set over the wreckage, the sizzling of hamburgers carried across the ruins like a foreign hymn. Neighbors gathered in doorways, torn between suspicion and yearning. Hunger was an unforgiving master, and yet trust came slower than appetite. The boy who had first tasted Coke sat on the steps of his ruined home, bottle cradled against his chest like a relic. He did not know the word America, not really. But he knew this: the world he had been taught to fear was suddenly feeding him. And that knowledge was as unsettling as it was sweet. The next morning, the smell returned, stronger, more inviting. By then, more townspeople were waiting, their ration cards still tucked in their pockets, their stomachs still hollow. They did not know what would be asked of them in return, but they knew they could not stay away. What came next would surprise them even more. The second week of July 1945 brought the same ritual. The Americans setting up their makeshift canteen in the schoolyard, the townspeople gathering cautiously along the fence, and the smell of sizzling meat mingling with the dust of ruined houses. Yet something had shifted. Curiosity was slowly conquering fear. Mothers who had once yanked their children back now lingered with them, eyes darting between the soldiers and the patties browning on the stove. Hunger was a more persuasive argument than suspicion. For most civilians, the last 6 years had been defined by scarcity. The German rationing system, introduced in 1939, had shrunk year by year until the final winter of the war left adults surviving on less than 1,000 calories a day. Bread was stretched with sawdust flour, sausages with ground turnip, coffee with roasted barley. Many still remembered the hunger winter of 1919, when starvation had followed Germany's defeat in the First World War. They expected this occupation to be worse. Rumors spread in hushed voices. The Allies would punish Germany with deliberate famine, perhaps even repeat Versailles with vengeance in their hands. Children had been told to expect cruelty. Instead, they were watching young soldiers hand out sandwiches. Private Robert Ellison, 19 years old and fresh from Iowa, had never known what it meant to skip a meal. At home, his mother had packed baskets of fried chicken for Sunday picnics, pies cooling on windowsills, and Coca-Cola bought in glass bottles at the local corner store. In Germany, he was struck by the thinness of the children pressing against the wire fence. He wrote to his sister, "They look at us like we're from another planet. All we do is hand them food. They stare at a Coke bottle as if it were treasure." His words echoed the larger paradox of the occupation: abundance meeting deprivation, generosity meeting mistrust. The first time a local man dared to step through the gate, his shoulders were hunched as if expecting a blow. He offered his ration card, as though food could only be obtained through stamps and signatures. The soldier at the stove laughed softly, shook his head, and placed a hamburger in his hands without asking for anything. The man froze, staring down at the hot bread and meat. His fingers trembled as he lifted it to his mouth. The first bite made him close his eyes. For weeks afterward he would recall the sensation of warmth spreading through his chest, not just from calories but from astonishment. Others followed. Children accepted bottles of Coca-Cola, struggling to describe the taste. Some thought it was medicine. One girl whispered, "It feels like drinking music." To the soldiers, it was only soda. To civilians who had lived through bombings, ration cards, and cold winters, it was alchemy. The numbers themselves told a story. By July 1945, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps was shipping nearly 15 million rations a day across Europe. Tins of Spam, powdered eggs, canned fruit, and chocolate bars were stacked in warehouses. Coca-Cola had established bottling plants near the front to ensure every American soldier could drink it. Those plants now poured out bottles that trickled into civilian hands, blurring the line between enemy and guest. The abundance was overwhelming, yet it also unsettled. Some older Germans muttered that this generosity must have a hidden cost. How could the same people who dropped bombs on Dresden now hand out hamburgers? A widow named Marta, 36, came with her 2 children one afternoon. Her husband had died in Stalingrad, her home reduced to rubble in an air raid. She had fed her children boiled nettles through the last winter of the war. Standing at the fence, she felt her stomach twist, not just with hunger but with humiliation. To accept food from the Americans meant acknowledging that her country, once proud and defiant, was broken. Yet when a soldier bent down to offer her son a hamburger, the boy's eyes widened with a brightness she had not seen in years. Marta let him take it. The sound of his chewing was almost unbearable in its joy. She swallowed her pride with her hunger and accepted a bottle of Coca-Cola. Later she admitted, "I had never tasted sweetness like that. I hated that I needed it. I hated that I loved it." For the Americans, this was not policy so much as instinct. General Eisenhower had instructed that the German people must not be left to starve, warning that desperation would breed chaos. Yet the daily gestures, the handing of a Coke, the flipping of a burger, were the work of ordinary soldiers acting from common decency. Letters home described it with casual pride. "Fed some kids tonight. Reminds me of little cousins at home." None of them realized they were reshaping perceptions one hamburger at a time. Laughter began to replace silence at the schoolyard. German boys mimicked the soldiers, pretending to flip invisible burgers in the dust. Girls sipped Coke from shared bottles, giggling at the fizz tickling their noses. The soldiers watched with amusement, shaking their heads at the children's delight. A private joked, "We're going to spoil them before their mothers can." Another replied, "If this is spoiling, maybe that's not such a bad thing." Yet underneath the humor was an unspoken tension. Was this abundance a glimpse of the future, or a temporary dream? Some feared that once the soldiers moved on, the town would sink back into hunger. Others whispered that American food was dangerous, that dependence on the occupiers would weaken what little dignity remained. Still, each evening, more came to the fence, their caution eroded by the irresistible smell of sizzling beef. The contrast was stark. Only blocks away, ration lines still stretched down Broken Street. Families still scraped burned flour from the bottoms of pans, still boiled weeds for broth. The schoolyard became a place where two worlds met, one of scarcity and one of excess. The sight of soldiers eating casually, tossing half-finished burgers aside, was as shocking as it was painful. For some, it stirred resentment. For others, it stirred longing. But for nearly everyone, it planted a seed of disorientation. Late one night, Marta confessed to a neighbor, "I don't know what frightens me more, going hungry or growing to depend on them." That unease reflected the larger conflict, the clash between humiliation and survival, between pride and the undeniable relief of a full stomach. By the end of July, the ritual had become routine. Children gathered early, women lingered nearby, and soldiers set up their stoves with practiced ease. A boy from Hoxne kept a Coke bottle hidden under his bed like a sacred relic, its glass empty but gleaming. For him, it was not just a bottle, it was proof that another world existed. A world where food was plenty, where laughter was casual, where even enemies could smile. But with every gift came a question that gnawed as deeply as hunger itself. Could kindness be trusted when it came from the hands of those who had conquered you? The answer was not yet clear. What was certain was that the schoolyard had become a stage where two nations, once divided by hatred, now met in the simple act of eating together. And what began with hamburgers and Coca-Cola was only the beginning of something larger, something neither side fully understood yet. By August, the schoolyard had become more than a place to fill stomachs. It was becoming a strange theater of transformation, where the act of sharing food carried meanings neither side could fully articulate. The first taste of Coca-Cola and hamburgers had eased hunger, but something deeper was beginning to take root, an unsettling question of trust, dignity, and identity in a land still smelling of smoke. For the German civilians, each bite was both a gift and a confrontation. A nation raised on the rhetoric of superiority now found itself fed by the very men it had been told were barbarians. Propaganda posters had promised American cruelty. Instead, their children licked ketchup from their fingers. Every swallow carried a clash of memory and reality. Marta, who once whispered her resentment, now found herself looking forward to the evenings at the fence. Her son, Carl, had grown less fearful, running ahead of her to catch the first whiff of grilled meat. She watched him laugh with other children as they clutched bottles of Coke, bubbles bursting at their lips. The sound was almost unbearable in its innocence, as if war's weight had lifted for a moment. The The soldiers noticed the shift as well. Private Ellison wrote in his diary, "They don't flinch anymore when we smile. Feels like we're breaking through something bigger than language." For men who had trained to kill, this reversal was jarring. Feeding former enemies was not what they had expected when they boarded ships for Europe. Yet here they were, turning occupation into communion, one hamburger at a time. The significance did not escape their commanders. General Eisenhower had warned of repeating the mistakes of 1919, when hunger and humiliation had fueled resentment. This time, the strategy was softer. Food became a weapon of peace, its impact measured not in destroyed cities but in rebuilt trust. By the summer of 1945, American forces were distributing more than rations. They were distributing symbols of plenty, wrapped in the form of hamburgers and Coke. It was soft power long before the term existed. For the Germans, the symbolism was almost too much to bear. The hamburger, greasy and simple, was a foreign dish that represented a culture of abundance. It was fast, filling, and unapologetically American. To eat it was to taste not only meat but also the possibility of a different world, one where scarcity was not the rule. Coca-Cola, with its fizz and sweetness, was even stranger. Its flavor was like nothing they had known, addictive and joyful, as if bottled optimism had been poured into their mouths. Children described it as drinking stars, while older men muttered that it must be laced with something unnatural. One evening, a teenage girl named Lotte stood at the fence with a Coke in her hand. She had lost her father to the Eastern Front and her brother to Allied bombing. The bitterness of grief lived in her eyes. Yet as she sipped, she laughed when the fizz tickled her nose, startling herself. She admitted later, "It was the first time I laughed without shame since the war ended." For her, the sweetness was not only sugar but also permission to feel human again. The conflict lay in the contrast. Pride told many Germans to resist this generosity, to see it as humiliation. Hunger told them to accept. The laughter of children told them something else entirely, that survival might mean opening to a future shaped by their conquerors. It was a dangerous thought, for it implied not just physical nourishment but ideological surrender. To drink Coca-Cola was, in a small way, to taste democracy. To bite into a hamburger was to admit that abundance could be shared across enemy lines. Statistics painted the backdrop. In 1945 alone, American forces distributed hundreds of thousands of tons of surplus food across occupied Germany. Care packages, introduced the following year, would extend this generosity even further. Boxes filled with powdered milk, fats, and canned goods sent by American families to strangers across the ocean. The recipients often wept when opening them. It was not just the contents but the handwriting on the labels, the proof that unknown hands cared enough to send something so precious. Ellison, watching Marta's son chew through a burger one evening, felt the weight of this contradiction. "I fought men who wore that uniform," he whispered to a fellow GI, "and now I'm feeding their kids. Feels like we're patching a hole with bread and meat." His companion replied, "Maybe that's exactly what we're doing." Yet suspicion lingered. Some townspeople refused to come near the schoolyard, convinced the food was poisoned or that the kindness was temporary. An old man spat in the dust when he saw children drinking Coke. "They will make you slaves with sweetness," he warned. The bitterness of defeat still ran deep. The hamburgers did not erase the memories of bombing raids, the craters where houses once stood, the photographs of lost fathers and sons. Still, the fence filled each evening. Hunger gnawed away at ideology, and slowly, the taste of American food carved cracks in hardened walls. Marta found herself torn each night between gratitude and resentment. She admitted to her sister, "I want to hate them, but then I watch Carl eat and I can't." What kind of world makes kindness feel like betrayal? The Americans, too, wrestled with contradictions. Some joked that they were teaching Germans how to eat properly. Others grew uncomfortable when they saw civilians' desperation. A private confessed in a letter home, "It feels strange. Back home, we throw food away. Here, they treat a Coke bottle like a diamond." Humor softened the edges, but unease remained. What was occupation supposed to mean, if not control? Feeding the enemy blurred the lines. And yet, beneath all the contradictions, something irreversible was happening. The image of a German child sipping Coca-Cola beside an American soldier was more powerful than any speech or policy. It suggested that the future might not be built on revenge but on the strange alchemy of shared abundance. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Marta's son held up an empty bottle, light glinting through the glass. He asked his mother, "Will it always taste this way?" She had no answer. For her, the sweetness carried both hope and dread. To embrace it was to accept a world reordered, one in which the victors fed the defeated not with punishments but with hamburgers. The question haunted her as she walked home past ruins. Could the future be built on the taste of another nation's abundance? Or would it fade as quickly as the fizz in a bottle left open too long? That night, the laughter of children echoed down the broken streets. The sound was lighter than the silence that had filled them before. And yet, just beyond the edges of that laughter, shadows lingered, whispers of whether this fragile bridge of food could carry the weight of history. What came next would reveal whether sweetness could truly mend bitterness, or whether it was only a fleeting flavor in the ruins of war. By the time autumn crept into the ruins of 1945, the schoolyard canteen was no longer an oddity but a fixture, its smells woven into the rhythm of the town. The sizzle of beef on metal and the hiss of soda bottles opening had become as familiar as church bells once were. Yet familiarity did not dull its strangeness. Each meal was still a reminder that enemies were feeding one another, that hunger and humiliation had somehow been folded into the warmth of bread and meat. Marta now walked to the schoolyard without hesitation, her son Carl running ahead, her daughter trailing shyly behind. She had lost the stiffness in her shoulders, though her pride remained a stubborn weight. Accepting food from the occupiers still burned inside her, yet she could not ignore the change in her children. Carl's cheeks had filled out, his eyes less sunken. Her daughter, once lethargic, now hummed softly after drinking Coke, as if the bubbles carried songs into her blood. These small transformations were undeniable. What gnawed at Marta was not just the food itself but the creeping sense that with every bite, they were tasting not only calories but an entirely different world. For the soldiers, too, the ritual had changed. What began as a gesture of goodwill now carried purpose. They saw in the civilians' faces not just gratitude but a softening of suspicion. Ellison, the boy from Iowa, noticed how the townspeople no longer clutched their ration cards when approaching the fence. He wrote home, "It's like the food has turned into a bridge. We flip burgers, and they see us not as conquerors but as neighbors." He did not realize that this small bridge was part of something larger. The hamburger and Coca-Cola were fast becoming emblems of American identity, symbols of abundance in a continent scarred by deprivation. The irony was thick. Only months before, American bombers had darkened German skies. Now American soda fizzed in German mouth. To some, this contrast was dizzying. An old man confessed, "I thought we would eat ashes forever. Instead, my grandson drinks the same drink as the soldiers who leveled our street." He shook his head, unable to reconcile the contradiction. Yet his grandson licked the sweetness from his lips without hesitation. The children were the first to embrace this new reality, their innocence less burdened by memory. By late 1945, official programs began to reinforce what the soldiers had started informally. Care packages, sent from American families, arrived tied in twine, filled with powdered milk, canned meats, and chocolate. Civilians lined up at distribution points with eyes wide, their hands trembling as they opened boxes labeled with foreign handwriting. The packages were more than food. They were proof that strangers across an ocean cared enough to send their own abundance. For Marta, holding a tin of condensed milk from a box addressed, "With love, Chicago," the effect was staggering. She murmured, "They know nothing of me, yet they feed my children." It was nourishment mingled with bewilderment. The ideological impact deepened with each passing week. German propaganda had depicted Americans as decadent, corrupted children by holding bottles just out of reach, then grinning as they surrendered them. Girls shyly mimicked English words they overheard, giggling when their accents drew laughter. Even the sternest elders found themselves softened by the sight. A grandmother, once defiant, admitted after sipping her first Coke, "I hate that it makes me smile." The sweetness was insidious, not just on the tongue but in the heart. By December, snow dusted the ruins. The stove still hissed, and the bottles still clinked. Marta stood one evening, Coke in her hand, as carols drifted faintly from a nearby church. She thought of her husband lost in Stalingrad, of the years of sacrifice demanded in his name, and of the strangers who now fed her children. She wondered if this sweetness, this abundance, was not just a meal but a message, that the world her children would inherit would be shaped not by the ashes of war but by the fizz of something new. The larger shift was undeniable. German civilians began to associate American presence not only with destruction but with unexpected generosity. Food became the language through which trust cautiously grew. The hamburger, greasy and simple, was a token of democracy. Coca-Cola, effervescent and sweet, was the taste of modernity. Together, they were more than calories. They were symbols of a world rebuilt on strange, unexpected foundations. Still, not everyone welcomed it. Some muttered that this was the beginning of cultural conquest, that sweetness would erode the old ways more surely than bombs. A teacher warned his pupils, beware. They want to win your stomach before your mind. By excess. Yet now that very excess was saving lives. To sip Coca-Cola was to confront the lie. To chew on a hamburger was to realize that abundance could be generous rather than grotesque. Even Marta, who clung fiercely to her dignity, felt the pull. Watching Karl laugh with soldiers one evening, she admitted quietly to herself, "They are not what I was told." The admission unsettled her more than hunger ever had. For the soldiers, the irony was also felt. Some wrote home with pride that they were teaching Germans how to eat. Others recognized something weightier. A corporal remarked, "This isn't just food, it's politics on a plate." He was right. The schoolyard was no longer only about filling bellies. It was the stage for the first taste of American influence, long before the Marshall Plan, long before official speeches promised Reconstruction. The hamburger and Coca-Cola were already laying foundations. Yet beneath this transformation lay unease. Was the sweetness a lasting cure, or a fleeting distraction? Marta worried about dependence, about what it meant for her children to crave foreign food more than the black bread of their ancestors. Pride whispered that each swallow was a surrender. But when she saw Karl's face bright with vitality, when she watched her daughter's thin arms regain strength, the whisper was silenced by relief. Survival was louder than pride. The laughter in the schoolyard grew contagious. Soldiers teased, yet even he could not keep the children from gathering each evening, eyes bright, stomachs eager. On the last night of the year, as fireworks cracked faintly over a battered town, Karl clutched his empty Coke bottle and whispered to his mother, "This tastes like the future." Marta looked at him, her heart torn between hope and fear. The words pierced her deeper than hunger ever had. For she realized then that her children were not only eating American food, they were swallowing an entirely new vision of the world. And as the new year dawned, the question lingered like smoke in the winter air. Could sweetness truly rebuild a shattered nation, or would it dissolve as quickly as the bubbles in an emptied glass?